The 1979 NHL playoffs were the last time that Montreal and Toronto met in the playoffs until recently in the 2021 Stanley Cup round of 16. But this event, ladies and gentlemen, was due to the fact that Lanny McDonald and Daryl Sittler were still together. Toronto had an okay season, made the playoffs as a strong contender. They were ninth overall in the league with 81 points. Now, the format at the time, the top teams would get a bye in the second round, while the lower tier teams would have to play a first round series. Now, Toronto, as the number 6 seed, played the number 3 seed Atlanta. This was the first playoff series meeting between the two squads, and Toronto never had trouble with the preliminary rounds. He swept them. Walt McKechnie scored a big shorthanded goal in the second period in the opener at the Omni, with Jean Pronovost tying, but McKechnie scored a winner 9-14 of the second. Now, Pronovost again, that made it 2-1. Now, the game is still available online through YouTube. Malik Palmateer was the star for Toronto in the game. He made 27 saves on 28 shots, with Dan Bouchard, the future Christian, the future Montreal killer and Montreal goat, had 19 saves. In Game 2 at Maple Leaf Gardens, it was all Toronto who scored 23 goals within 23 seconds of the first period. Sittler scored twice, with Ron Ellis as part of his comeback after 77 Worlds scored. Pronovost scored in the power play to make it 3-1. In the second period, Pat Poutet, his first of the postseason, Don Maloney on the power play made it 5-1. Chouinard made it 5-2, with McKechnie and Pat Poutet with his second made it 7-2 after 2. Now in the third, the diminutive Bobby Lalonde scored in the power play to make it 7-3, with Willie Plett scoring his first of the postseason, make it 7-4. Daniel Bouchard gave up 7 goals. Lemaire was called into third, and he stopped everything. Palmateer made 22 saves on 26 shots. Now, when Toronto played Montreal in the second round, we knew it wasn't be as good as the semifinal round the years before. And despite the fact that Toronto took an early 1-0 lead in Game 2 and made it 2-0 on a Don Maloney goal in the second, shot at 4:33 and Lafleur on the power play, 13-5 tied it. And the third, it was all Montreal, as Lemaire scored twice. He should have been a Connie Smythe winner that year, with Yvon Lambert scoring on the power play to make it 5-2. Dryden made 26 saves, while Palmateer stood on his head for most of the contests, made 28 saves on 33 shots. Now, back in the form in Game 2, it was all Montreal. Gainey and Lafleur scored in the first, with Lemaire scoring his third on the power play to make it 3-0, with Gainey and Schutt scoring in the third, with Lanny McDonald potted a late marker at 17 seconds to stop the shutout. 27 saves for Kenny Dryden. Now, Palmateer didn't play the whole game. Paul Harrison relieved in the third, on the way on the third period. Now, notice that name Paul Harrison will come up big in Game 4. Now, in Game 3, back in Toronto, in a game that's probably one of the strangest finishes in Montreal Canadiens history, Toronto had led 2-1 after the first, after Napier opened the scoring. Sittler and McDonald scored singles. Now, Robinson tied in the second period, and Jacques Lemaire put him in ahead 3-2. Daryl Sittler extended Toronto's possibility in that contest to make it 3-3. Now, the first overtime, I think Dougie Jarvis wasn't available to play. Steve Shutt was injured. And of all people, a man who rode the bench for most of the season and came over from the WHA, Cam Connor, on a broken play, scored in the second overtime at 5:25. Palmateer made 40 saves, and Dryden made 38 of 41. Now, Palmateer was suffering from, I think it was an elbow injury, had to have surgery to relieve pressure, and did not play Game 4. Now, here it gets kind of freaky, ladies and gentlemen, because I call this the Tiger Williams game because of a inopportune penalty he took in overtime. Yvon Lambert opened the scoring for Montreal at 6:55, where Robinson at 7:57 to make it 2-0. Mondeau scored at 8:06 in the second, followed by the young star Pat Hughes at 10:31. But of all people, Rocky Sagnek, who was a big star in the minor leagues for Toronto, scored at 14.56. And Darryl, with his fifth in the postseason, scored at 16.06. And in the third, Walt McKechnie with his fourth and Don Maloney with his third tied it. Now, in the overtime, Tiger Williams took a very, very bad penalty, and Robinson scored at 4:14, and it was so freaky. Williams was trying to get after the linesman and referee after the contest, and Robinson had to tie him down. Now, Harrison had a good game, stopping 30 or 35. Dryden was kind of a wreck in that second period, giving up 2 goals in 19 seconds. Made only 29 saves. So what did this mean for the Toronto fans watching this series? Well, see, the problem is when Toronto had a good team in the mid-70s, were playing Flyers in the first or second round. And here we go again. Toronto had a good team in 78 and 79, but they're playing Montreal. Montreal was a number 1 seed, while Toronto in the modern era would be like an 8 seed. But Toronto gave all they can. He gave Montreal all they can handle. And Jimmy Jones, the defensive stalwart, who was a big factor in them beating the Islanders in 78, was a big factor in the series. I think he stopped Guy Lafleur as best he could. Now, Montreal, of course, went on to play Boston, even though he won the 2 games at home, 4-2 and 5-2. Boston came back and won games 3 and 4 at the Garden in Nazi dominant fashion, 1-goal games. Montreal won 5-1 back at home to get a 3-2 lead. Then he played Boston back in Boston. Boston won 5-2. And despite a 3-1 lead, too many men in the ice killed him, and he lost 5-4 to Montreal in overtime in the Yvon Lambert goal, where Savard picked a pocket of Rick Melton in the Montreal zone. Tremblay, Houle, Lambert, the typical set played. He came back and won. Now, Kenny Dryden was pretty well a sieve in those last games against Boston, and it showed in the first game against the Rangers. The Rangers had led strongly 4-1 after 2. Michel Larocque was brought in. And an errant shot by Doug Risebrough stopped Larocque from starting in Game 2 in practice before the contest. Risebrough took him out. Dryden gave an early 2-0 lead, but from then on it was Montreal. 4-1 from Montreal at the Rangers, and of course the double overtime game where Robinson scored, it didn't count, and Savard scored about 2 minutes later to make it so. And back at home, Lemaire scored a Stanley Cup winner. Should have been a Conn Smythe Trophy winner. So Toronto, big problem was they were as good as a 5th-ranked team, but they were facing the top teams in the league. In the early 70s, it was Boston, then it was the Flyers, then it was Montreal. Now, the only reason why they bet the Islanders in 78 is that they weren't really ready to go as a team, and they were relying too much on Trottier. But when Bossy showed up, they were outscoring the opposition, and Islanders were a much better team with Merrick and Goring later on than they were in 78. Like I said, they were just, I think they took Toronto too lightly. So that's the story of how Toronto played Montreal again in the playoffs in 79 after losing a tough series in 78. Toronto was a top 4 team most of the 70s, but the problem is they're playing number 1, number 2, or number 3 seeds, dating back to when he took Boston, the Bobby Orr team, the 5 games. So we like what we're doing here with our profiles on the Maple Leafs as part of Sports File. Let us know when to like, comment, subscribe, or share.